The Lamborghini's windshield shattered in 6 hits. I watched from my doorway as the HOA president swung a Louisville Slugger into a $340,000 car parked legally in my driveway. She was screaming about property values and unauthorized vehicles. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was who owned that car. The man standing next to me wasn't just my guest. He was the district attorney. And he'd seen everything. The police arrived 4 minutes later, but by then, the damage went far beyond broken glass. She'd just committed felony vandalism in front of the one person in the county who could bury her. That should have been enough. But what happened in the courtroom 3 weeks later didn't just destroy her. It exposed something the entire HOA had been hiding for years. Before we jump into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you've ever had a crazy HOA moment, hit subscribe so you don't miss how this ends. I bought the house in Ridgemont Estates because it was quiet. Tree-lined streets. Brick mailboxes. The kind of neighborhood where people waved when they mowed their lawns. The HOA seemed harmless at first. Monthly fees. A few basic rules about lawn height and fence colors. Standard stuff. I met Patricia Kemp 2 days after closing. She showed up at my door with a binder. Thick, laminated tabs. She introduced herself as the HOA president and handed me a welcome packet that felt more like a legal contract. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She told me the community had standards, that everyone was expected to contribute to the collective appearance. I thanked her and closed the door. That should have been my first warning. The first notice came 3 weeks later. A yellow envelope tucked into my screen door. It said my trash cans were visible from the street after 7 p.m. on a non-collection day. I'd forgotten to roll them back after work. The fine was $25. I paid it. Figured it was easier than arguing. Then it was my mailbox. The number decal was faded. Another notice. Another fine. Then my car. I'd parked in my own driveway, but apparently the nose of my sedan extended 3 inches past an invisible property line that aligned with my neighbor's hedge. $50 fine. No warning. I started reading the HOA bylaws. All 68 pages. Patricia's name appeared in the revision history 17 times. She'd been president for 6 years. Every amendment tightened control. Guest parking required prior approval. Exterior paint changes needed board review. Even patio furniture had to meet aesthetic alignment standards. I didn't know it then, but I wasn't the only one getting notices. My neighbor 2 houses down mentioned he'd been fined for a garden gnome. Another resident got cited for hanging an American flag that was supposedly 2 inches too large. No one fought back. It was easier to comply. Then my brother called. He was coming into town for a long weekend. He asked if he could stay with me. Said yes. I didn't think to mention it to anyone. He arrived on a Friday evening in a gray Lamborghini Huracan. I'm not a car guy, but even I knew it was expensive. He'd rented it for a business trip and decided to extend the rental through the weekend. He parked it in my driveway. We went inside. Had dinner. Caught up. The next morning, there was a notice on my door. Hand-delivered. It wasn't even printed. Patricia had written it herself. It said that luxury vehicles visible from the street created inequality perception and violated community harmony standards. The car needed to be removed within 24 hours or I'd be fined $200 per day. I read it twice. I called my brother outside and showed him. He laughed. Said it had to be a joke. But I'd been living there long enough to know Patricia didn't joke. I called her. She didn't answer. I left a voicemail. Professional. Polite. I explained it was a guest's vehicle. Temporary. I asked if we could discuss it. She called back 30 minutes later. Her voice was clipped. She said the rules applied to everyone. No exceptions. She said if I'd submitted a guest vehicle approval form 72 hours in advance, this wouldn't be an issue. I didn't know that form existed. I told her my brother was leaving Sunday. 2 days. She said that wasn't soon enough. The car needed to be gone by noon Saturday or the fines would begin. Then she hung up. My brother offered to move it. Park it at a hotel. I told him no. It was my driveway. My property. I'd paid for the house. I wasn't going to let someone dictate what kind of car could sit in my own driveway for 48 hours. That decision changed everything. Because Saturday morning, Patricia didn't just come back with another notice. She came back with a bat. Saturday morning, 9:47 a.m. I was in the kitchen when I heard the first impact. It wasn't loud enough to be a crash. More like a heavy thud. Then another. I walked to the front window and saw Patricia standing in my driveway. She was holding a baseball bat. The Lamborghini's windshield had a spiderweb crack spreading from the center. She swung again. I ran outside. My brother was right behind me. By the time we reached the driveway, she'd hit it 6 times. The windshield was destroyed. The driver's side mirror hung by its wiring. There was a dent in the hood. She turned and looked at me. No panic. No regret. She said the car was in violation and I'd been warned. She said if I refused to follow the rules, she'd enforce them herself. My brother pulled out his phone. Started recording. Patricia didn't flinch. She set the bat down on my lawn, pulled a citation form from her purse, and handed it to me. It listed the damages as community-initiated corrective action. She walked back to her car and drove away. I called the police. They arrived 12 minutes later. Took photos. Took statements. The officers said it was clear-cut vandalism. Felony level because of the damage amount. He said they'd follow up with Patricia and file a report. That should have been the end of it. But when the officer ran my address for the report, something else came up. There was an outstanding code enforcement complaint against my property. Filed that morning, before Patricia destroyed the car. It claimed I was operating an unlicensed short-term rental. That I was violating zoning laws. That multiple luxury vehicles had been seen coming and going at unusual hours. None of it was true. But it was on record now. The officer told me I'd need to contact code enforcement on Monday. He couldn't do anything about it. He left. My brother called the rental company. They said the damage was covered, but he'd need a police report and an insurance claim. The car was towed an hour later. I thought that was the worst of it. Sunday morning, I found notices on 6 other doors in the neighborhood. All printed on HOA letterhead. All warnings about suspicious activity at my address. It said residents should report any unusual vehicles or guests they observed near my home. It said the board was investigating potential violations that could affect property values. My neighbor, the one with the garden gnome, knocked on my door that afternoon. He told me Patricia had called an emergency board meeting. She was pushing for an emergency special assessment to cover legal fees and community protection measures. He said she was trying to make the entire neighborhood pay for a lawyer to go after me. I didn't even know what I was being accused of. Monday, I called code enforcement. The complaint had been filed anonymously, but the details were specific. It claimed I'd rented my home on Airbnb for 3 separate weekends in the past 2 months. It included dates. Photos of cars in my driveway. None of it was real, but disproving it meant gathering bank records, utility bills, work schedules, evidence I didn't have organized. The inspector said he'd have to schedule a site visit. Until then, the complaint stayed active. Then my lawyer called. I'd reached out to him Sunday night. He'd reviewed the HOA bylaws and the notices I'd received. He said Patricia had overstepped. That the destruction of the car was criminal. That the notices and complaints could be considered harassment. But he also said something I wasn't expecting. He said the HOA had broad authority under the covenants. That unless I could prove she was acting outside her role as president, maliciously, personally, it would be hard to hold her accountable in civil court. He asked if I'd done anything to provoke her. I hadn't. Tuesday, I received a certified letter. The HOA was fining me $1,200. $200 per day for 3 days of guest vehicle violations, plus a $600 fee for emergency board proceedings related to my property. I had 10 days to pay or they'd place a lien on my house. My brother felt terrible. He offered to cover it. I told him no. This wasn't about the money anymore. Wednesday, Patricia sent an email to the entire neighborhood. It was titled Community Safety Update. It said that due to recent concerns about unauthorized commercial activity, the board was implementing a new guest vehicle registry. All visitors would need to submit license plate numbers, make and model, and duration of stay at least 72 hours in advance. It also said that any resident under active investigation would be prohibited from hosting guests until the matter was resolved. I was being isolated. Thursday, my brother left. Before he got in the Uber, he told me something I hadn't known. He said he wasn't just visiting. He said he'd wanted to tell me in person. He'd just been appointed to a new position. He'd been the assistant district attorney for 8 years. Last month, he'd been promoted. He was now the district attorney for the county. And Patricia had destroyed his car in front of him. I asked him why he didn't say anything. Why he let her walk away. He said because he wanted to see how far she'd go. How much she'd escalate. Whether she'd try to cover it up or double down. He said she just made this a lot easier. Friday morning, Patricia received a subpoena. Not from me. From the county. She was being charged with felony vandalism, criminal mischief, and filing a false report. The police report from Saturday had gone directly to my brother's office. And that's when everything started to unravel. Because once the charges were filed, the HOA tried to distance themselves. They released a statement saying Patricia had acted independently. That the board didn't authorize or condone her actions. But my lawyer found the meeting notes. The emergency session on Sunday. Patricia had told the board exactly what she'd done. And they'd voted to support her. Now they were all exposed. But what came next wasn't just about the criminal case. Because when my brother's office started looking into Patricia's HOA activities, they found something else. Something that had been buried in financial reports and meeting minutes for 3 years. And it was about to come out in court. The arraignment was scheduled for the following Thursday. Patricia showed up with a lawyer. Expensive suit. Confident posture. He entered a not guilty plea and requested a jury trial. The judge set a court date for 6 weeks out. That should have been routine. But during the arraignment, my brother's office filed a motion to introduce additional evidence. Financial records. HOA meeting minutes. Bank statements dating back 3 years. The judge allowed it over the defense's objection. Patricia's lawyer looked confused. This was a vandalism case. Why were they pulling HOA financials? I didn't understand it either. Not yet. 2 days later, I received a call from an investigator with the district attorney's office. Not my brother. He'd recused himself from direct involvement to avoid any appearance of bias. The investigator asked if I'd be willing to provide testimony about the HOA's operations, about the fines, the notices, the patterns of enforcement. Said yes. She told me they'd found irregularities. That during the investigation into Patricia's actions, they'd noticed something in the HOA's quarterly financial disclosures. The numbers didn't match. Fines collected versus fines reported. Assessment fees versus actual expenses. Someone had been skimming. And it wasn't small amounts. The investigator said they were building a separate case. Embezzlement. Fraud. Potentially racketeering if they could prove it was organized. She said Patricia had been HOA president for 6 years. That the discrepancies started 8 months after she took office. She asked me how much I'd paid in fines since moving in. I pulled my records. 11 fines over 7 months. $1,847. She asked if I had proof of payment. I did. Canceled checks. Bank transfers. She told me to hold on to them. That I'd likely need them for court. 3 weeks before the trial, the HOA held another emergency meeting. I wasn't invited, but my neighbor, the one who'd warned me before, recorded it on his phone and sent me the audio. Patricia's voice was shaking. She said the district attorney's office was overreaching. That this was a personal vendetta because of my brother. That the community needed to stand together. She proposed a vote to use HOA funds to cover her legal defense. The motion failed. 8-3. 2 board members resigned that night. The local news picked up the story 4 days later. Not the vandalism, that was too small. They reported on the embezzlement investigation. They said the DA's office had subpoenaed records from 17 homeowners in Ridgemont Estates. That investigators believed over $89,000 in HOA funds had been misappropriated over a 5-year period. Patricia's name was in the headline. The neighborhood turned. Overnight. People who'd followed every rule, paid every fine, stayed silent out of fear, they started talking. Someone created a Facebook group. Residents shared their notices, their fines, their experiences. One couple had been fined over $4,000 in 2 years. Another had been forced to repaint their house twice because Patricia claimed the color didn't match the approved palette, even though it did. The pattern was clear. She'd targeted people who wouldn't fight back. People who'd pay quietly. And she'd pocketed the money. The week before trial, Patricia's lawyer tried to negotiate. He offered a plea deal on the vandalism charge. Guilty plea. Restitution for the car. Community service. No jail time. The DA's office declined. They wanted the trial. Because the trial wasn't just about the Lamborghini anymore. The courtroom was small. Maybe 40 seats. Half of them were filled with residents from Richmond estates. People I'd seen mowing their lawns. Walking their dogs. They'd come to watch. Patricia sat at the defense table in a navy blazer. Hair pulled back. Expressionless. The prosecution opened with the vandalism. They showed the police photos. The shattered windshield. The dented hood. The bat. They called my brother to the stand, not as the DA, but as the victim. He testified calmly. Described what he saw. Confirmed the value of the damage. Explained that he'd identified himself as a guest, not a resident, and that he'd been told the car was in violation of rules he'd never agreed to follow. The defense tried to paint Patricia as a dedicated volunteer. Someone who'd spent years managing a community. Who'd made a mistake in a moment of frustration. Then the prosecution introduced the financial records. The courtroom went quiet. They showed spreadsheets. Payments from residents that never appeared in the HOA's books. Fines recorded at half their actual amounts. Deposits into Patricia's personal account that matched, almost exactly, the discrepancies in the HOA's records. They called a forensic accountant. He walked the jury through it. Showed how $200 fines became $100 in the records. How violation fees were listed as administrative costs. How the missing money lined up with Patricia's mortgage payments, her car lease, her vacation expenses. She hadn't just stolen from the HOA. She'd weaponized it. The defense had no answer. They tried to argue the records were incomplete. That the HOA's bookkeeping was disorganized. That someone else had access. But the prosecution had her signature. On every amended bylaw. On every fine adjustment. On every bank deposit slip. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Vandalism. Embezzlement. Fraud. The sentencing hearing was set for 2 weeks later. But before that, something else happened. The HOA dissolved. Residents voted to terminate the association entirely. Without Patricia, without enforceable leadership, and with the financial mess left behind, no one wanted to rebuild it. The covenants were nullified. The bylaws erased. The fines voided. Richmond Estates became a neighborhood again. Not a controlled community. And Patricia, she was facing 8 years in state prison. But that wasn't the end of it. Because when the sentencing hearing finally came, the judge didn't just hand down jail time. He ordered full restitution. Every fine she'd collected. Every dollar she'd taken. It totaled $94,600. She didn't have it. Her house went up for sale the next month. Her car was repossessed. Her lawyer stopped returning calls. The DA's office sent letters to every resident who'd been fined under her authority. They explained what had happened. They offered refunds. I got a check for $1,847. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that she'd thought she was untouchable. That the rules gave her power. That no one would ever stand up. And she'd destroyed the one car that belonged to the one person who could end her. Patricia was sentenced to 6 years in state prison. The judge reduced it from 8 because she had no prior criminal record. But he made it clear during sentencing that her actions weren't just about vandalism or theft. They were about abuse of trust. About using authority to exploit people who believed they had no choice but to comply. He said she'd turned a neighborhood into a personal revenue stream. She didn't speak during the hearing. Didn't apologize. Her lawyer read a brief statement saying she accepted responsibility, but her face showed nothing. No remorse. No acknowledgement of what she'd done to dozens of families over half a decade. She was let out in handcuffs. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. The restitution payments started 2 months later. Small checks. $50 here. $100 there. The court had garnished her pension and seized her assets, but it would take years to repay everyone. Most residents didn't care about the money anymore. They cared that it was over. But the damage didn't disappear overnight. The HOA dissolution left a legal mess. Ridgemont Estates had been governed by recorded covenants tied to every property deed. Removing those covenants required individual homeowners to file quitclaim amendments with the county. It cost $120 per household. Some people refused, said they didn't want to pay to undo something they'd never wanted in the first place. It took 11 months to fully dissolve the association. During that time, the neighborhood changed. People who'd been fined for mailbox colors or lawn ornaments started personalizing their homes again. Garden gnomes reappeared. One couple painted their front door bright red. Another put up a flagpole that was definitely not HOA compliant. It felt like the neighborhood exhaled. But not everyone was relieved. 3 families moved out within the first year. They said they'd bought in Ridgemont specifically because of the HOA. Because they wanted rules, structure, uniformity. They didn't say Patricia's name, but the implication was clear. They blamed the rest of us for dismantling what they'd paid for. I understood that, even if I didn't agree. One of those families, older couple, 2 houses down, stopped speaking to me entirely. They'd been some of Patricia's most loyal supporters. They'd voted in favor of funding her legal defense. When the embezzlement came out, they claimed they didn't know, that she'd hidden it from everyone. Maybe that was true. Maybe they really didn't see it. But they'd also never questioned why fines kept increasing. Why enforcement was so aggressive. Why people were afraid to hang a wreath without approval. They'd benefited from the control, even if they didn't profit from it. My brother visited again 6 months after the trial. Different car this time. A modest sedan. He parked it in my driveway without hesitation. We sat on the porch and he told me something I hadn't known. The investigation into Patricia had triggered audits of 3 other HOAs in the county. 2 of them showed similar patterns. Inflated fines. Missing funds. Board members with unexplained income. One of those cases was still ongoing. He said Patricia wasn't unique. That HOAs operated with very little oversight. That once someone gained control of a board, it was almost impossible to remove them without a legal fight most homeowners couldn't afford. He said the system was designed to protect the association, not the residents. That scared me more than Patricia ever did, because it meant this could happen anywhere. I asked him if he regretted not stepping in sooner, if he wished he'd told Patricia who he was that morning in my driveway. He said no. He said if he'd intervened, she would have stopped. Apologized. Covered her tracks. The vandalism charge would have been minor. The embezzlement would have stayed hidden. He said sometimes you have to let people show you who they really are. And Patricia did exactly that. The Lamborghini was never fully repaired. The rental company wrote it off as a total loss. My brother's insurance covered it. He said he didn't think about the car anymore. But he did think about the moment Patricia handed me that citation. The moment she justified destruction as enforcement. He said that moment taught him something about power. That people don't abuse authority because they're evil. They abuse it because they've convinced themselves they're right. That the rules matter more than the people affected by them. That control is the same as leadership. Patricia believed she was protecting the neighborhood. That she was maintaining standards. That people like me, people who questioned her, were the problem. And maybe, in her mind, she still believes that. I drive through Ridgemont Estates now and I see a different place. The lawns aren't as uniform. Some mailboxes are faded. A few houses could use fresh paint. But people wave again. Kids play in the street. Someone set up a little free library at the corner. It's not as pristine as it was under Patricia's rule. But it feels like people actually live here now. I still get questions sometimes. Neighbors who weren't involved ask what really happened. New buyers moving into the neighborhood ask if the HOA is coming back. I tell them the truth. That we had someone in charge who saw authority as permission. Who used fear to fund her lifestyle. Who forgot that neighborhoods are made of people, not properties. And I tell them what I learned. That the most dangerous rules aren't the ones that seem unreasonable. They're the ones that seem minor. The ones you pay because it's easier than fighting. The ones that make you think, it's just $25. Because those small rules teach you not to resist. And once you stop resisting, someone like Patricia can take everything. The last time I saw her name, it was in a court filing. She tried to appeal her sentence. Claimed the prosecution had overstepped. That the financial crimes were unrelated to the vandalism and shouldn't have been tried together. The appeal was denied. She'll be eligible for parole in 4 years. I don't know what happens after that. If she'll move away. If she'll try to rebuild. If she's learned anything. But I do know this. If I ever get another notice on my door, from an HOA, a board, a neighbor with a binder full of rules, I'll read it carefully. And I'll ask one question before I pay, before I comply, before I assume someone else knows better. Who does this rule actually protect? Because the answer to that question changes everything.